get started. Less than 2 minutes, more like one. All right. Welcome everyone to this mid-March CCA workshop on a Wednesday. Wonderful to see everybody. Great to see some old and some new faces. Welcome, welcome. We are in luck today. We've got a pair of speakers. Our guests here today are Gwen Rugg from the Bridge at NORC and Jessica Feldman from the Mellon Foundation. And they're going to be presenting on sort of lives and livelihoods of artists in the US and the results of their excellent and important survey of this hard to pin down population of people. And they're a little squirrely. So I'm excited to see what such a serious effort, a dedicated effort to do this and not just, grab whatever other data we happen to have laying around, but to actually do this the right way. And so I think we're going to learn a lot. I'm excited to hear about all of this. As we go, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And then when they finish up their presentation, obviously we'll throw it all open for the Q and the A part to those things, and you can raise your hand and talk then too. But if you've got something you wanted to make sure you make a note of it, put it in the chat and we'll get to it. With no further ado, Gwen, Jessica, please take it away.
Great. Thank you, Doug. And thank you, Joanna. Really appreciate the invitation to be here and share with you today. So as Doug mentioned, my name's Jessica. I'm a sociologist. I work as a researcher in the Arts and Culture Grant-Making Program at the Mellon Foundation in New York City. And I'm really here just to set the scene and share a little bit about the motivation for Mellon commissioning the National Survey of Artists. And then I'm very excited to turn the presentation over to Gwen Rugg, who will discuss the survey in more depth and really explore the two main questions, really the squirreliness that Doug referred to, right? So the design questions behind the survey. How did we conceptualize and screen in artists from a general population? And then how did we design a survey to capture the working lives of artists who hold multiple jobs and engage in gig work? So like I said, this discussion will really actually mostly focus on the survey development process, the challenges, the decision points, the considerations informing the design, and then think about some of the potential implications for future substantive and methodological research. So just to step back and set the scene, in 2020, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, my grant-making colleagues were in uncharted territory, trying to enact responsive grant-making to an unprecedented situation. And as my colleagues worked with our grantees and partners to design programs and initiatives that were attentive to artists' needs and lived realities, and again, at a national scale, at an unprecedented scale, a number of the fundamental descriptive questions about the lives and livelihoods of artists arose. And these were basic questions, such as how many artists live and work in the United States today? Who are these artists? So what observations can we make about, for example, their education, their income, the number of dependents, disability, age, health insurance coverage, et cetera? How do artists support themselves economically? What was the extent of their need? And this raised questions about, for example, how many jobs do artists hold in a calendar year? Are those jobs full-time? Are they temporary? How many artists are monetizing their creative practices? How do they do so? And I'll just note really quickly that when my colleagues went looking for this information in 2020, that was before we had the NEA's really great NASERC resource. So I think the task would be considerably easier today. But when we did go searching for these answers, we encountered data that had particular limitations, not in the context in which it was designed, but in the context in which we wanted to learn more about how artists were faring in that particular precarious moment. So we found data from surveys that weren't nationally representative, but instead drew on convenience samples, lists of program applicants or participants, surveys that used institutional lists. We saw a lot of that in 2020, with many artist service organizations surveying their members and constituents to better understand the impact of the pandemic within a given role, within a profession, within a particular sector. We also found studies that were naturally representative using a conceptualization of artists that would fail to identify an unknown number of artists, including those whose working lives we were really interested in better understanding at that moment. So the American Community Survey, the Current Population Survey, use a definition of artists that focus on working in one of 11 specific occupations as their primary job in the case of the ACS, primary and secondary job in the case of the CPS, potentially missing artists who work in sectors or jobs unrelated to artistic practice, who work in other artist occupations, or who aren't necessarily compensated for their labor, or those who weren't working in an arts job during the survey reference week. So using that definition of artist labor, the NEA estimates that artists make up about 1.6% of the total labor force. I think that most recent estimate is from 2023. Other sources were overly broad for our desire to understand the needs and working conditions of dedicated artists. So we see in the survey of public participation in the arts, that estimates how many people create artworks, produce creative writing, engage in artistic performance. But that engagement could be as an amateur, as a hobbyist, as a journal writer, as a social dancer at weddings, for example. So with that very broad definition, the SPPA estimates that about 52% of the US adult population created any artworks or any performances for any reason or intent, and that estimate's from the 2022 SPPA. So in response to finding, on the one hand, this kind of narrow portrait of artists based on a strict definition of labor, and on the other hand, this very expansive accounting of any arts engagement for any reason on the other, a group of my colleagues and I turned to Gwen and her team at NORC to help design a new survey. And now I'm going to turn things over to Gwen, and she's going to share more about that process.
Thanks, Jessica, and hey everyone. I'm Gwen. I'm a senior research scientist at NORC, and it's very nice to be here today. So, as Jessica said, the name of the game here was really to design and field a nationally representative survey that was meant to include an artist population that other current surveys out there are not able to speak to. So I'm going to get into the study design. As Jessica alluded to, we're really going to use most of our time today to talk about some of the key design considerations with the survey, knowing that we've already put out this, sort of basic findings report, and then a lot of you will have already looked at the kind of top line findings from the actual data. So there are a couple of unique features of this study that we just want to direct your attention to. One of them, as we mentioned, is just that it is a nationally representative group of artists. So the artist sample we generated is reflective of the US population of artists as a whole. And to get at this sample, we turned to three different sample sources. We used one probability-based sample, that is NORC's Amerispeak panel, which is a general population panel that we run. And then we also looked to two non-probability samples. One of them was a third-party non-probability vendor, and the other was Snap. We actually worked with the folks at Snap to survey folks from their list. And then we, surveyed these three populations, and we then combined the data to make all of the data nationally representative using a sample calibration methodology that we have at NORC that's called True North. And there is a whole very, very long technical report available if you're interested in the methodological nitty-gritty of how we did that, but I'm just gonna leave that discussion here for now. A second unique feature of this study, as Jessica already alluded to as well, is that it has a distinctive means of identifying who an artist is. Of course, there is no singular correct definition of who counts as an artist. But for this study, we sought to locate a population of essentially like professionalized artists, but where professionalism isn't necessarily just tied to your job title or how much money you might make through your art. And this ended up giving us an artist pool that is really more inclusive than those sample sources that sort of just counted artists according to specific occupational categories. But at the same time, it's more restrictive than, the very broadest conceptualization of artists that Jessica alluded to with the SPPA, for example. And then the third feature of this study that I want to call your attention to is that it really captures quite extensive detail on artists' employment. A lot of the data that we have on artist employment right now really looks mostly at either their primary job or their primary and secondary jobs. And we intentionally asked about work beyond primary and secondary jobs to try to get at some new information. So we're really happy that this study offers these features, as we know that there are things that provide something valuable to the field. But regarding these latter two features of the study, how we identified artists and how we captured their work, each of those presented a really significant methodological challenge to tackle. And what we want to offer today for this group, many of you are researchers yourselves, is kind of a detailed reflection on how we approached these two challenges, because we know they're things that anyone who's interested in artists will have to grapple with in the course of their own research. So, in summary, the rest of the presentation today will focus primarily on these two challenges. Just how did we identify artists, within the context and goals of this study? And then how do we capture their work arrangements? So for the first challenge, how do we identify artists? We took 3 different steps while we were working our way through essentially developing a screener to determine whether someone sort of counted as an artist. And I'll actually kick it back to Jessica to discuss the first one of these items, because this is something that her team led.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. Yeah, so one of the first steps that Mellon, the Arts and Culture program, took in order to inform our discussions with Gwen's team about the scoping of a new survey was first to just generate a comprehensive inventory of existing data sources that provided estimates, particularly national population level estimates, of the demographic and livelihood characteristics of artists, noting how artists were identified within each data source. We also conducted a literature review of published research, documenting how artists have been defined in the context of different research questions, and how researchers have operationalized those definitions in data collection to generate different empirical portraits of artist populations. I want to share just 3 select points from our lit review that informed our discussions with NORC about the parameters for developing an artist screener, and then Gwen will share more about the specific steps of the screener development. So first is that the SPPA offered a kind of a winnowing model of how to conceptualize a screener. At the time, we were looking at 2017 SPPA data. So in that data, we saw 54% of the US population engaged in artistic practice at least once in the prior year. And we assumed this was well beyond what we would anticipate as an outer bound estimate of dedicated and or working artists in the US. But we drew design inspiration from an additional SPPA question that asks all those who did engage in artistic practice about the intended audiences of their art. And in the 2017 SPPA across all art making practices, 46% of respondents stated that they make art just for themselves. 37% only for people they know personally, and then 17% for the general public. And so this model of winnowing from kind of the most personal, or from the most expansive to the most personal, informed the inclusion of an audience criterion in our screener, and also the stepwise nature of the screener, which again, Gwen will discuss in more detail. Second, drawing on my background as a sociologist, reading, for example, Howard Becker, and also my colleagues' experience being really deeply embedded in professional networks of artists, we conceptualize artist identity as something held not only by an individual, but also understood in the context of a community of practitioners. And so that suggested that we needed mechanisms beyond self-identification. And then third, we needed questions that would function across disciplines. So in our lit review, we identified a number of really interesting methods that worked within a given discipline. So surveys drawing on institutional lists such as memberships and professional associations or unions, using credentials such as awards or degrees, or things like CV reviews for public presenting. But we realized we would need a screening mechanism that worked across all artistic practices, including those that don't have clear educational pathways, organizing institutions, or standard forms of recognition. And ultimately, what we wanted was a screener with a sensitivity that would allow us to learn more about the livelihoods of artists who have a dedicated practice and work within an expressive tradition that extends beyond their personal gratification, like we were talking the journal writers, for example, and which is recognized by a broader community of practice, but who may not be formally employed as an artist, who may not earn any money from their practice or any money beyond expenses, who may not have the affiliations or credentials that I just mentioned, who may not even label themselves as an artist. And just briefly before handing this back to Gwen, I want to reiterate that the intent here was not to draw a line between who is and isn't an artist or make any definitive statement about that outside the context of this study. Rather, we wanted to identify a set of people with dedicated artistic practices, people trying to make a go of it in the arts, really understanding their needs in that moment, whose livelihoods we were particularly interested in learning about because we had the sense that they weren't represented in existing national surveys. So that was the literature review that informed the development of this artist screener.
Yeah, and then the next step that we took was our research team compiled and reviewed existing surveys about artistic and cultural engagement, and also labor, finances, well-being. And we assembled a database of, I think, over about 150 relevant existing survey items for reference in our own survey design. And where possible, our team just adopted previously validated survey items verbatim. And then in other cases, we took inspiration from existing validated items to create new questions that better aligned with the specific objectives of our survey and the specific artist population. And if you all are interested, we do have source information for each one of our survey items. That's in a questionnaire crosswalk that we created that's in the technical report that accompanies the findings report. And then a final step that we took was that prior to designing and administering the full survey, we designed and conducted a pilot survey. And the pilot was really focused on testing the efficacy of 8 potential screening questions that we thought we might want to use to identify artists. And these initial questions were developed and workshopped collaboratively between NORC, folks at Mellon, and our study had an advisory group that was very involved in the development of the screener questions as well. So in the pilot, we tested, potential screener questions with about 5,000 people from NORC's AmeriSpeak panel. And the questions that we asked spanned several topics from what artistic disciplines people do to whether they might count as a traditional artist or as a teaching artist, the ways that they engage with their art, whether is it for a hobby, is it professionally, how much time they spend on their art, who their intended audience is, how others would perceive them, and what their sort of primary artistic practice is. And once we had pilot data, we did a couple things. One was conducting a sensitivity analysis. So we analyzed pilot data to essentially examine the basic demographic characteristics of individuals who would or would not have screened into the survey if we were to implement various combinations of screener questions. And we checked these data against the full pilot sample to assess whether specific criteria combinations would noticeably bias the artist sample in any way. And then beyond doing that analysis, we really drilled down into responses to each individual potential screener question. And we did notice various issues that led to several changes from the way we asked something in the pilot to what ended up making it onto the main survey. So we just wanted to walk you through a couple of those really quickly. One thing that we did as a result of the pilot was we added nuance to questions that we thought made the questions better. And a good example of this is the very first question we ask in the survey is basically, what artistic practices do you do, if any? And you're just seeing a snippet of the way we asked it in the pilot. You're seeing the snippet where we asked about performing arts related practices. And when we were looking at pilot data, we noticed pretty high responses for a lot of the artistic disciplines that we were asking about, even some of the more kind of like niche disciplines. So we were worried that people might have glossed over the sort of active creation component of this question, the creating or performing part of it. And we were worried that people might also be thinking about the things that they attended, for example. So we modified this question structure slightly, and our final survey looks a little bit different. We essentially kept the STEM the same, but we really tried to emphasize the active verbs that we wanted them to be thinking about, the creating and performing element here. And we reinforce that in the NA option that you can see at the bottom here. Another thing that we did as a result of the pilot was there were some screener questions that we were considering that we just ended up removing entirely. So, for example, we originally had a standalone question basically trying to determine whether someone might be counted as a traditional artist or culture bearer, because we really wanted to make sure that we were capturing those folks in the survey. And then later in the pilot, so we asked this question, but then later in the pilot, we asked another question that was about how one engages with their artistic practices. And one of the options, the final option you can see is they engage as a culture bearer. And when we actually analyzed the pilot data, we noticed that when asking about creating art as a culture bearer, that covered basically almost all of the people who also said that they were traditional artists in question 2. So we concluded that we could cut question 2, make the screener a little shorter, and not sacrifice the sample that we wanted to make sure that we were including. And then one other thing we did as a result of the pilot was we sometimes added response options. So we had one question about who might consider the respondent an artist. And we had an open-end option at the end, and others specify. And when we actually got into that open-end data, we ended up seeing that a lot of people's responses converged around one group, which is a person's religious or spiritual community. So we ended up just adding that as a standalone response option on the final survey. So that's kind of a sneak peek behind the scenes at what went into getting us to our final artist screener. And through the processes we just described, we ended up landing on a set of 5 criteria. I just want to walk you through. So the first criterion was an artistic practice. So what creative activities a person does. And we very intentionally included an expansive range of practices that were considered eligible for the survey. We had, I think, 31 different artistic practices that enabled people to screen into the survey on any of those practices. And I think that's compared with like NEA reporting on professional artists, I believe, looks at about 11 different practices. The second criterion was engagement, so how someone engages with their creative practice. And the goal here was really to make sure that we were able to filter out folks who exclusively engage in their art making as a hobby. So we wanted to basically capture everyone else, so anyone who said that they engaged as a professional or a former professional, as a teacher, as a culture bearer, all of those screened in on this item. The third criterion was an audience criterion, so who people share their artistic work with. And the goal here was really to include people who share their work publicly in some way. So you would screen in on this criterion if you said that you made some effort to share your work with basically any group beyond just your kind of immediate friends and family. The fourth criterion was a recognition criterion. So would others sort of call someone an artist? And the goal here was to really get at how one might be perceived in the world. And we intentionally framed the question this way rather than asking a question about whether one self-defines as an artist, because we know that, whether one self-defines as an artist, it can be kind of fraught and influenced by many factors, from like someone's cultural background to what their level of formal training is to their, sort of own perceived level of success. So we really decided to not use the self-definition question as a screener item, even though we did ask that later in the survey as well, but instead ask how others would perceive you. And then the final factor was just an hours criterion. So how much time do people spend on their creative practices? And the goal here was really to screen in people who have a consistent artistic practice. We set the threshold very, very low at just an hour or more per week. So those were the 5 criteria that we landed on as a result of this pilot process. And using these criteria, how many artists did we find? So our screener, as Jessica said, it was inspired by the kind of winnowing process that happens in other studies. So our screener was kind of a similar funneling process where people either screened out or continued on at a few different junctures. So that's why you'll see sort of diminishing percentages as you go down the screen. But ultimately, using these screener criteria, we got to an 18% incidence rate of the US population. And so our sample of artists ended up being about 2,600 people. And now, of course, remains a fact, as we said earlier, that there really is no best or correct definition of an artist. We made the decisions that we made according to the processes we described, and other people might consider, a different definition of an artist. And to that end, one of the sort of intentional and explicit goals of this study was to make a public use data file available for people. So essentially, if someone disagrees with the criteria that we settled on, while they can't widen them, they could use our data set to further restrict them or tighten them, and then look at the data for just the subset of artists that they want to look at. So for example, if you wanted to look at just people who say that their primary job is in the arts, you could just look at that particular group of artists. So those are some reflections on the process of screening artists into our sample. Now turning to the other major methodological challenge that we had to tackle, which was how the heck do we capture their work arrangements? As Jessica said at the onset, one of the 3 primary goals of the survey was to learn about how artists support themselves. So this was really in large part a labor survey, fundamentally. A lot of the survey real estate was dedicated to questions about work. So we took a lot of care with how we went about constructing the work questions on the survey. And I want to shout out Joanna there. She was very helpful in providing some feedback, as well as some other labor economists that we consulted. So in the process of developing the work questions, again, we conducted a literature review and a survey instrument scan that really focused on how to capture information on what could be called non-traditional work or alternative work or gig work, goes by many names. And this was intended to ensure that the survey items about work would be set up in such a way that we'd be able to capture the kind of unique work arrangements that artists might be more likely to hold, part-time work, self-employed work, temporary, seasonal work, things like that. So the lit review really focused on key learnings about how best to capture alternative work arrangements via survey research and kind of what the best practices are there. And then accompanying this review, we again created a big database of surveys that have captured information on alternative work, both among the general population of workers and for artists specifically. And I think we had a bank of like over 400 questions there, which then again served as a reference for developing our own items. And through this process, we basically learned that trying to capture alternative work arrangements via survey research is tricky, and it poses a couple very like special challenges. So we just wanted to walk you through a couple of the main challenges that we identified and how we went about addressing those in our survey. So one challenge is that, there's no definitive approach to what counts as an artist, there's no definitive approach to what sort of counts as alternative work or an alternative worker. So the guidance in the literature there was just like at the onset of the survey design process, you just have to set really clear parameters around what you mean by each of these terms to align with the survey's specific goals and target population. So we spent a lot of time doing this at the very onset of the survey development. Another big takeaway was that a lot of existing surveys basically fail to adequately capture things like multiple job holding, secondary or supplemental work, intermittent work, and informal work. And this issue is particularly important for surveys of artists, again, given their presumably outsized rates of things like multiple job holding, intermittent work, etc. So what we did here was we took steps to basically explicitly inquire about these types of work arrangements and to provide examples to emphasize that these types of activities should count as work on the survey. So just to show you a couple examples of what we did here, these were the instructions that were given to people at the very onset of answering questions about their jobs. So, we start out by saying many people earn money through jobs or paid activities. Following questions ask about up to 4 jobs or paid activities you might have done. And then the next sentence, these could include any full-time or part-time activities at which you've been employed or were self-employed. They could also include paid gigs, side jobs, or informal paid activities. And then we went on to give examples of jobs or paid activities that we thought might be the kinds of things that people might not automatically include. So we gave examples like acting, teaching, babysitting, owning a business, working as an employee, driving for Uber, waiting tables. We wanted to give just like a full kind of range of examples of the types of work that counted here. And then one other thing that we did was we explicitly included separate question items that asked about temporary work arrangements. And we asked a question that would help us assess whether any given job someone reported was part-time. A third challenge that we tackled here was that the literature suggested that workers might misclassify their work arrangements if the terms that were used on the survey don't reflect their own understanding of work. And artists might be especially likely to self-misclassify for one of 2 reasons. The first reason is if an artist doesn't see their creative practice as work, and they thus, don't report on it when responding to work questions. And the second reason the artists might self-misclassify is the converse. So if they view their creative practice as their only kind of real work and thus don't report on other non-arts related work they might do, like waiting tables, for example. So how we addressed this challenge, we did several things. One was that we used employment categories that we thought would resonate with artists. And we actually looked to the SNAP survey to draw our different employment categories. We also took steps to account for artists' unique relationship to work, and I'll give an example of that in a minute. And that includes things like unpaid labor. And then finally, we used probes and confirmatory questions when we were asking about things that we thought might be misinterpreted. So just a few examples here. Here's an example of the kind of confirmatory questions on our survey. We asked in the past 12 months, did you do any jobs or other paid activities? This refers to anything that you've done for pay. And then after they reported their jobs, we asked them once again, just to confirm, in the past 12 months, did you do anything for pay, even for as little as an hour? The goal here was truly to beat them over the head with the idea that any paid activity counts as work on our survey. We made them kind of confirm that twice before moving on from the job questions. And one other thing that we did was we asked a question that specifically asked about different forms of unpaid labor that artists might do, because we know that's an issue in the artist labor force. And we wanted to make sure to kind of capture and recognize that the different forms of unpaid work. And finally, one other sort of job-related challenge that we tackled was that the literature suggested that work activity reference periods can really have significant bearing on whether alternative work arrangements are reported on surveys. Especially if a short reference period is used, it's much more likely that will, fail to capture short-term work that people might engage in. And so we intentionally used a pretty long reference period on our survey. We asked about work that people did in the past 12 months. And that's longer than a lot of employment surveys typically use, but we really wanted to make sure that we were doing what we could to capture artists' intermittent work and seasonal work. So that is how we navigated our way through these two kind of tricky issues of finding artists and then capturing their work for this study. Now I'm going to kick it back over to Jessica to just do some reflection on what comes next, what might come next now that the study has concluded.
Great, thanks, Gwen. So as we mentioned at the beginning, this project grew out of Mellon's desire to support the creation of a new nationally representative data set that would provide us with more extensive data on how artists make a living and get by using all the methods that Gwen just laid out, and capturing this information for a wider set of artists with non-traditional work arrangements than had previously been represented in national data. We also wanted to support other social scientists, arts administrators, and artists who might want to use this new artist income and employment data and data on a new population of artists to advance their own research agendas. And to that end, while we're really not going into the descriptive findings, we want to just briefly make everyone aware and share the set of topical areas that are covered in the survey. And to note also, I think as Gwen mentioned before, you can download the survey instrument, the technical report, the top-line report, and documentation from NADAC. And many thanks to the NEA and to the folks at ICPSR for hosting that. So the survey covers topics including dimensions of artistic practice and identity, sources of income, characteristics of job holding, and Gwen just talked about some of the technical challenges there. We asked about kind of 1 to 3+ jobs, and for each of those, there was a loop that captured information on each unique job. Was it temporary or permanent? Was it full-time or part-time? What was the employer type versus were you self-employed? It's the sector of employment and your earnings. We had questions on self-assessed well-being and financial precarity. We also asked about access to benefits and insurance coverage. And with that question, we asked about if somebody received their insurance through employment, we asked about whether or not that job was in the arts sector or not. And then finally, we had a set of questions on household composition and respondent demographics. And so hopefully within all of that, there may be data resources relevant to some of your own projects. And that was really one of our hopes, is that this could be of use to the broader research community.
And then I'll just end the sort of presentation portion of this with some additional thoughts about ways that we would potentially like to kind of continue to test and refine our survey instrument, the methods that we use. So, in addition to supporting further substantive research on the lives and livelihoods of artists, we also recognize that there are some fruitful areas for continued methodological investigation and refinement. Especially if we were to do the survey again, or if someone else were to draw from our survey instrument to use for their own, I kind of want to offer a wish list of first certain survey items that we think could benefit from further testing. One is, of course, just the artist screener questions. Even with all the care that we put in there, we still have lots of questions about how artists understood the questions, how they understood their practices in light of those questions. For example, how did the terms culture bearer or teaching artist resonate? Did they actually only select the art forms they actively did versus just like attended? We just have a lot of questions like that we would love to investigate further via sort of targeted cognitive testing. And then another thing that we would love to test more is just, again, our conceptualizations of jobs. As we discussed during the design process, we really wrestled with things like how to contend with alternative work arrangements, how to help people see that those should count for the survey. But we really also had to just face thorny questions about how to even bound the concept of a job. Like, for example, if you babysit for 5 different families, does that mean you have one job as a babysitter, or do you have 5 distinct jobs? Just questions like that. And we tried to solve for these issues, as we mentioned, but we would love to do some like A/B testing to kind of empirically test the implications of these design decisions on, different response patterns. And then one other sort of avenue we're currently exploring methodologically is the feasibility of doing this survey again, but with a goal of achieving a larger N to enable additional types of analysis. And state level analysis is really the thing that we're most focused on. The data file that is public use currently allows for geographic analysis at the RAO level, the Regional Arts Organization level. So there are like 6 regions: New England, Mid-Atlantic, South, Midwest, Mid-America, and West. However, we know that many grant makers, art service organizations, and policymakers are really responsive to artists' needs at the state level. And since the study came out, we've gotten several inquiries asking if we could do state level breakouts to inform different types of initiatives, like how to best offer technical assistance to artists, how to do funding distribution for artists in a given state. And that's just not really possible with our current data. It's just not meant for state level analysis. But because we're hearing this need repeatedly, we at NORC are now kind of working through what it would take to potentially increase the artist sample size. And that just really comes down to how far our nationally representative panel can be pushed without sacrificing data quality. So we're kind of gaming out a number of options on that now. So that's kind of our wish list of some methodological considerations we would love to explore further. And I think with that, we'll end the presentation portion of this presentation and turn it over to any questions that anybody might have. Oh, and I'll just put up on the screen, here's the link to access the data via NADAC if anyone wants to, and here are email addresses in case you want to stay in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. So we've got some time for Q&A. I have 700 questions, but I'm not going to ask them because I have too many. I want to see what the room wants to ask here. You please raise your hand if you've got questions and stop me from hogging all of this. Anyone want to jump in first? While you're thinking about that, I'll jump in first. So my first question, you say that the samples reflective of the entire U.S. population. I'm curious what you think, like what population you have in mind there. What U.S. population? The whole U.S. adult population, just the subset that passes the screener, something like that. So if you could reflect a little bit more on what you think this is representative of.
Great question. So the sample frame that we used was, as I mentioned, NORC's AmeriSpeak panel, and that is representative of U.S. adults age 18 and older. So that's actually a really important distinction to make. This is only artists who are 18 or older in the United States. And if it's helpful, just to give a little bit more background on the actual sample frame, the AmeriSpeak sample frame is representative of, I think it's 97% of US households in the United States. So we sample at the household level and then drill down from there. So that should give pretty good assurance that the sample is truly representative of American adults.
Love it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Carol.
Thanks, Doug. Thank you so much. What an amazing resource and so carefully constructed. And it's incredible to see our research infrastructure being invested in this way. And my question actually has to do with that. I'm curious whether you all have talked or thought some about how to expand the investment in the research infrastructure further than just making the data available to folks like people who are on this call. I wonder about how to better get arts administrators who are specifically focused on research, and also many faculty members who now are really in danger of having, I mean, we already had so few resources for faculty research in this field. And that's just not looking like it's going to get too much better in the near future. So I'm curious about how to leverage this really great resource that is like at the gold standard of providing us with information so that more and more people are actually able to accomplish some research with it.
That's such a beautiful question, Carol. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what happens after you put the research out into the world is always a big unknown, and you can have lofty ambitions, but we only have so much control over how it ends up getting used. I will say that we're We're really making efforts. I mean, I think the two groups you alluded to specifically were kind of arts administrators, potentially at cultural organizations and faculty. And we're certainly working the presentation junket quite extensively right now. We'll be presenting on this study at AAM, the American Association for Museums, in Philly in a month or two. And that was, intentionally chosen to, increase awareness among museum and cultural organization workers about the study. We're also doing talks at different schools. Like I'm speaking at the School of the Art Institute and here in Chicago about the study next week. But we want to continue thinking creatively and broadly about how to get the findings out there to the groups that it might be most helpful for. Jessica, is there anything else you want to say there, or do you think that covers it pretty well?
I hope that, yeah, like Gwen has a wish list, I have a wish list, so I hope to be able to share more about that wish list soon.
Okay. Yeah, even more so than getting the findings out. I mean, some of like what SNAP has been doing and what Wallace has been doing to actually have as a part of the research project umbrella, bringing in people to spin off additional research that relates to their broader portfolio. I
Yes.
think when you have like a gold standard resource like this, just that can be so useful to growing its impact.
It's really helpful to hear that, and I'm actually really glad to hear that. I won't spoil anything, but there is something along those lines that we are currently working on, and I can't talk about quite yet, but stay tuned.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Carol, for that question, because it reminds me I wanted to thank Gwen and Jessica, not just for the presentation today, but for doing this in the first place and making the data available. That's so much of the arts space is full of a bunch of inaccessible proprietary data. So wonderful that you thought of us, the rest of the public, and put it out there. I've got a great question here from Sarah's class, or from Sarah, about income and whether or not you had asked questions to capture grants for specific projects from foundations or arts orgs, and whether or not anything in the survey can inform whether they sort of cashed the checks or had to spend that money on supplies or other things. And so how much sort of a net income question there. And then another piece is other sources of income, like earned revenue from selling artworks or performances, or passive income sources. So
Great question. And the answer happily is yes. I don't remember exactly which question item it is on the survey instrument, but there was a very detailed question about all of the different income sources that an artist made any money or even in kind money from over the past year. And that did include specific items for, individual grants as well as earned revenue from selling artwork and passive income. So yes, I think all of the specific things that you all are asking about were response options within that question.
great. And as Sarah says, awesome in the chat. So thank you.
Oh, and Jessica says Q9. It's Q9. So,
No.
and the survey instrument, I should just say, is downloadable in addition to the data.
Which, again, like as Carol's saying, there's sort of a foundational gold standard research resource for people. People can start replicating and doing this A/B testing and taking this stuff out in the field and using that instrument to maybe get at some of those wish list questions you've got, which I think are also really interesting. I love the babysitting analogy. I'm going to use that one. So, all right, no other hands are up right now. I'm going to go into one of my other questions, which is, what question does Neil Alper have to ask?
Yeah, first of all, I want to commend them for the work they did. I started doing research on the economics of artists with a survey 40 years ago. which I don't think you've referenced, which is a little disappointing on my part from my perspective. But I'm looking for a little clarification. You talked about having 31 practice areas amongst artists compared to 11 practice areas using the SOC codes. I'd like to know where they differ, because I think by calling those 11 artist occupations the SOC codes is sort of suggesting that those are the only artists that they're surveying. I mean, that's really potentially misleading. So I'm curious, because there are many sub-occupations within each of those SOC codes. And so I'm just curious, how does your 31 compare to all of those occupations that are covered by the SOC codes? No, I saw an earlier presentation of yours. You decided to drop designers, which I found interesting as well. So that only gets us down to 10. So I wonder if you could clarify that. I'm curious, how do those 31 codes differ from all of the codes that are really accounted for by the 10 of the SOCs?
Great question, Neil. Thank you for asking that. And I do want to say we did review your work when we were designing this survey. So and I know Jessica has some notes on it. So thank you for your earlier contributions to this research. And yeah, that's a great question. So I think what we mean to say here when we talk about the 31 versus the 11 is that we made an intentional design decision to ask about practices at sort of like a sub-disciplinary level. So there are the sort of like umbrella discipline areas like performing arts, visual arts, etc. And we grouped the activities that we asked about within those sort of umbrella disciplines. But then under any given discipline, we explicitly defined several sub-disciplines that could fall underneath that. So I think I showed the example of performing arts, earlier in the presentation, and there were numerous specific performing arts that we called attention to. And so you do make a good point that when one is, thinking about the SOC codes, any number of those subdisciplines could plausibly fall underneath like one of the codes. It's just that we wanted to explicitly call attention to the sort of full range of artistic practices as we saw them, just to help people see themselves in the question. That was really the goal, is just to help people recognize that these art forms, if they do practice them, that we wanted to make sure to capture them.
Can I ask a follow-up question? What do you
Please.
think has led to your study showing 18% artists in the labor force versus what most studies using Census Bureau with a lot more observations than you folks have in a scientifically drawn sampling and population data? What have you identified as to the key explanation as to why you found such a difference in terms of the number of artists?
Great question. We've done a lot of thinking about that. And the incidence rate, it did surprise us too, to an extent. Like it is higher than we might have thought it would be. We didn't really know what to expect, because one of the fundamental research questions for this study was just to get at an incidence rate. It is like going back to that funnel, which I could pull up and screen share, but I won't. We basically started with answers to that very first question. Just, did you do any of these, 31 artistic activities? We started with a really high number, like 97% of people said that they did one of those activities over the past 12 months. And that's, much higher than the SPPA, which, as Jessica said, I think reports that like 54% said that they created art of some kind over the past 12 months. So that's quite a notable difference. And this could, quite frankly, be attributable to any number of factors. The two surveys ask the question in just such different ways. Ours is just one question versus obviously the SPPA, which has, a whole number of questions asking about specific art forms and ways of engaging. Our question was the very first question on the survey, so there could be, a tendency among respondents to want to sort of affirmatively answer that first question. It could be something just in the sort of verb plus activity construction of the question. It could be just with the interpretation of the categories. Photography was the highest reported activity that people said that they do. And I mean, every American has a cell phone with a camera, right? So photography alone could have really blown up that number. But one thing that we noticed, and I know we're at time, so I'll end it here, is that for whatever it's worth, our study and the SPPA actually had quite commensurate winnowing when looking at just people who said that they made art at all versus those who made it in a more sort of professionalized context. I think on the SPPA, out of everyone that had an artistic practice, so that's 54% of adults, 17% said that they made art for the general public. And in ours, it was basically 18% said that they did it professionally. But it's just that we were starting with that 97% of people who said that they made art versus the 54% who said that they made art. So, I mean, that's our conjecture. That's kind of why we want to do a lot more testing with the artist screener questions, because we do have so many questions about how well they worked. But we did think that sort of comparison with the winnowing with the SPPA was interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Gwen and Jessica. That got to, some of the other questions that I would have had. I think that's one of the big elephant in the room type questions is how do we square your sort of tenfold larger incidence than what we get from these other measures? And not just what do we make of those other 90% of the artists we were missing? Who are they? What do they look like? And why do we miss them? And I think that's the exciting part of this data set is it lets us see them. They're now more visible. And so we can start studying them and learn a lot more. So I'm excited to see where this goes next. Thank you to Gwen and Jessica. Look at all those applauding hands floating up on my Zoom screen. It was a wonderful presentation. We will see everyone back here in 2 weeks, I believe, for the next presentation. If you stick around for probably 30 seconds, I'm going to guess Becca's going to paste something in the chat about it. But otherwise, thank you all for coming by this Wednesday afternoon, and we'll see you again in a couple weeks. Thanks again to our speakers.
Thanks, everyone.
That was wonderful.